The dust kicked up from beneath Clara's worn boots as she hurried down the main street of Millbrook, her mother's old apron tied tight around her slender waist. The morning sun cast long shadows between the weathered buildings, and already the heat promised to be merciless. She clutched the small cloth bag of coins in her pocket, counting them once more in her mind, barely enough for another week's worth of flour and beans. Her mother's cough had kept them both awake again last night, each rattling breath a reminder of how precarious their situation had become. At barely 17, Clara had never imagined she'd be running the family's small restaurant alone. The Sagebrush Diner had been her parents' dream when they'd arrived in this dusty cattle town 5 years ago, full of hope and determination. Her father had built every table and chair with his own hands before the fever took him 2 winters past. Now it was just Clara and her mother, Sarah, who spent most days confined to the small room above the restaurant, too weak to stand for more than a few minutes at a time. The bell above the diner's door chimed as Clara pushed inside, immediately enveloped by the familiar smells of bacon grease and coffee that seemed permanently embedded in the wooden walls. The restaurant was small, just 8 tables, and a long counter that her father had carved from local pine. But it had been their sanctuary. Now it felt more like a burden she wasn't strong enough to carry. "Morning, Miss Clara," called out Tom Bradley, one of her few regular customers, a gray Encapoke who worked for the Henderson Ranch. He was already seated at his usual spot near the window, hat resting on the table beside him. "The usual, if you don't mind." Clara managed a smile and nodded, though exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. She'd been up since before dawn, kneading dough and preparing for another day of serving meals to whoever might wander in. The work was endless. Cooking, cleaning, serving, managing what little money they had. Every night she fell into bed with flour under her fingernails and the persistent ache of worry in her chest. As she moved behind the counter to start Tom's breakfast, the door chimed again. This time it was Jake Morrison, a rancher she knew by reputation more than personal acquaintance. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and weathered by years under the sun, with steel gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Most folks in town spoke of him with a mixture of respect and wariness. He owned the largest spread in the county, ran cattle across thousands of acres, and kept mostly to himself since his wife had died in childbirth 3 years back. Jake removed his hat and took a seat at the counter, nodding politely to Clara. His presence filled the small space, and she found herself uncharacteristically nervous as she approached with the coffee pot. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, filling his cup. "What can I get for you today?" "Just coffee for now, miss," he replied, his voice deep and measured. "And it's Jake. No need for formalities." Clara nodded and turned back to tend to Tom's breakfast, aware that Jake's eyes followed her movements. She cracked eggs into the hot skillet, the familiar sizzle providing a momentary distraction from her mounting anxieties. The rent on the building was due in 2 weeks, and she was at least $20 short. The thought of losing the restaurant, their home, made her hands tremble as she flipped the eggs. "Excuse me, miss," Jake's voice cut through her worried thoughts. "Are you all right?" Clara looked up to find both men watching her with concern. She realized she'd been standing frozen, spatula in hand, staring at nothing. Heat flooded her cheeks with embarrassment. "I'm fine," she said quickly, plating Tom's breakfast with practiced efficiency. "Just tired, I suppose." Jake's gray eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. There was something unsettling about the way he seemed to see right through her careful composure to the fear and exhaustion beneath. Tom asked gently as Clara set his plate down. "Haven't seen her around lately." She's been under the weather," Clara replied, the understatement feeling heavy on her tongue. The truth was that her mother was getting worse each day, the cough more persistent, her appetite nearly gone. Dr. Martin had been by twice in the past month, and both visits had cost money they didn't have, only for him to shake his head and prescribe rest and better nutrition. Luxuries they couldn't afford. Jake continued to watch her as she bustled around the kitchen, and Clara found his steady presence both comforting and unnerving. There was something about him that suggested strength and reliability, qualities that had become foreign concepts in her increasingly unstable world. The morning passed slowly, with only a handful of customers stopping by. Clara served coffee and simple meals, her movements automatic after years of practice, but her mind remained clouded with worry. Each ring of the cash register seemed to mock her, $1 here, 50 cents there, never enough to make a real difference. Around noon, when the lunch rush that never materialized had failed to appear once again, Jake still sat at the counter. He'd nursed 2 cups of coffee and ordered a simple plate of beans and cornbread, but seemed in no hurry to leave. Clara found herself stealing glances at him as she cleaned tables and swept the floor, wondering what kept him here when he surely had ranch business to attend to. "Miss," Jake said finally, when the restaurant had emptied except for the 2 of them. "Might I speak with you for a moment?" Clara's stomach tightened with apprehension. Had she done something wrong, said something inappropriate? She approached the counter slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir. I've been coming through town regularly for supplies," he began, his voice careful and measured. "I've noticed things have been difficult for you lately." Clara's face burned with shame. The last thing she wanted was pity, especially from someone like Jake Morrison, who seemed to have his life well in hand. "We're managing just fine," she said, lifting her chin with as much dignity as she could muster. Jake nodded slowly, but his expression remained kind rather than skeptical. "I'm sure you are. You're clearly a capable young woman. But I have a proposition that might benefit us both." "What kind of proposition?" "My ranch hands have been complaining about the food situation out at my place. I've got a cook who's better suited to shoeing horses than preparing meals, and the men are getting restless. I've been thinking about hiring someone to come out and cook proper meals for the crew." Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she tried not to let hope show on her face. "How many men are we talking about?" 12, including myself. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. It would mean closing this place temporarily and moving out to the ranch, at least until your mother's feeling better. I've got a small cabin you and she could use, and I'd pay you well, more than you're making here, I'd wager." The offer hung in the air between them like a lifeline. Clara's mind raced through the possibilities and problems. The money would solve their immediate crisis, but leaving the restaurant felt like abandoning her father's dream, and moving to the ranch with her sick mother seemed impossibly complicated. "I don't know," she said finally. "This place, it's all we have left of my father." Jake's expression softened. "I understand. But sometimes holding too tight to the past can keep us from saving the future." Before Clara could respond, a fit of coughing echoed from upstairs, harsh and prolonged. Both she and Jake looked toward the ceiling as the sound continued, each cough seeming to tear at Clara's heart. "That's my mother," Clara whispered, starting toward the stairs. Jake said quietly, "Think about what I said. I'll be in town until evening if you want to discuss it further." Clara climbed the narrow stairs to their living quarters, her legs feeling heavier with each step. She found her mother propped up in bed, her face pale and drawn, a handkerchief pressed to her mouth spotted with alarming flecks of red. "Mama," Clara said, rushing to her side. "Let me get you some water." Sarah Morrison looked up at her daughter with eyes that still held warmth despite the obvious pain. "I heard voices downstairs. Was that Jake Morrison?" "Yes, Mama. He offered me a job cooking for his ranch hands." Sarah studied her daughter's face carefully. "And what did you tell him?" "I said I'd think about it." "But Mama, I can't leave you here alone, and I can't abandon Papa's restaurant." Her mother reached out and took Clara's hand, her fingers thin and cold despite the warmth of the day. "Clara, my dear girl, your father would want you to survive. The restaurant was just wood and nails. You and I are what mattered to him. But if we leave, we might lose it entirely. The rent, buildings can be replaced, sweetheart. But if we don't do something soon, I'm afraid." Sarah's words were cut off by another coughing fit, this one worse than the last. Clara held her mother's hand and felt the weight of responsibility settling even more heavily on her young shoulders. The choice seemed impossible. Abandon her father's dream or watch her mother waste away while they slowly starved. That afternoon, Clara found herself unable to concentrate on anything. She burned a pot of stew, dropped a plate while clearing a table, and gave the wrong change to 2 different customers. Her mind kept returning to Jake's offer and her mother's words. The rational part of her knew that moving to the ranch was probably their best option, maybe their only option. But the stubborn, scared part of her clung to the familiar walls of the restaurant, like a drowning person gripping a piece of driftwood. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and orange, Jake returned. Clara had been expecting him, though she still felt unprepared for the conversation they needed to have. "Have you given any more thought to my offer?" he asked, settling back onto his stool at the counter. I have, Clara replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But I'm scared, Mr. Morrison, Jake. What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't handle cooking for so many men? Jake leaned forward slightly, his gray eyes serious but kind. Miss Clara, I've eaten your food. You're a fine cook, better than fine. And as for handling the men, they're good boys mostly. They'll treat you with respect or they'll find themselves looking for work elsewhere. What about my mother? She's quite sick, and I can't leave her. The cabin I mentioned is small but comfortable. There's a good well nearby, and it's close enough to the main house that you could get help if needed. Martin makes rounds out our way once a week. I could arrange for him to check on her regularly. Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The offer was more generous than she had any right to expect, and she found herself wondering why this man, essentially a stranger, was willing to do so much for them. Why? She asked suddenly. Why are you being so kind to us? Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup as he stared out the window. I suppose because I know what it's like to feel like you're drowning, he said finally. After my wife died, I thought I might go under entirely, but people helped me, neighbors, ranch hands, even strangers who had no obligation to care. Sometimes that's how we survive, by helping each other. The simple honesty in his words broke through the last of Clara's resistance. She thought of her mother upstairs, growing weaker each day, and of the empty tables around them that should have been filled with customers. Pride was a luxury they could no longer afford. When would you need me to start? She asked quietly. Tomorrow, if you're willing. I can bring a wagon to help move your things, and your mother if she's up for the journey. Clara nodded slowly, feeling as though she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. All right. Yes, I'll take the job. Jake's stern features softened into what might have been relief. Good. I think this will work out well for all of us. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, with the promise of rain hanging heavy in the air. Clara had spent most of the night packing their few belongings and preparing her mother for the move. Sarah was weak but determined, insisting she could make the journey despite Clara's concerns. Jake arrived as promised with a sturdy wagon and a gentle mare to pull it. He helped Clara carry their trunks and boxes downstairs, his strength making light work of loads that would have been impossible for her alone. When it came time to help Sarah down the stairs, he did so with surprising gentleness, supporting her weight as if she were made of spun glass. As they prepared to leave, Clara took one last look around the restaurant. The tables and chairs stood empty, surfaces clean and ready for customers who might never come. She touched the bar where her father had spent so many hours planning their future and whispered a quiet goodbye to the life they were leaving behind. The ride to Jake's ranch took most of the morning, the wagon wheels creaking rhythmically as they traveled through rolling hills dotted with cattle. Clara sat beside her mother in the wagon bed, one arm around Sarah's frail shoulders, watching the landscape change from the dusty streets of Millbrook to the vast openness of ranch country. The Morrison Ranch was larger than Clara had imagined. The main house was a sprawling structure of log and stone, built to withstand the harsh winters and blazing summers of the frontier. Outbuildings dotted the property, a large barn, several sheds, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and corrals filled with horses. Everything spoke of prosperity and careful management. The cabin Jake had promised was small but clean, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace. It sat about 50 yards from the main house, close enough for easy access but far enough to provide privacy. Clara helped her mother settle into the larger of the 2 rooms, while Jake carried in their belongings. The kitchen's in the main house, Jake explained once they had finished moving. I'll show you around whenever you're ready. The men usually eat at sunrise noon, and just after sunset, nothing fancy required. They're used to simple, hearty meals. Clara nodded, trying to absorb all the information while simultaneously worrying about her mother and fighting her own nervousness about cooking for so many strangers. Take today to get settled, Jake continued. You can start tomorrow morning if that suits you. That evening, as Clara sat beside her mother's bed watching Sarah sleep fitfully, she wondered if she had made the right choice. The cabin felt strange and unfamiliar, filled with the sounds of an environment she didn't yet understand. Through the small window, she could see lights in the bunkhouse where the ranch hands were settling in for the night, and the sight reminded her that tomorrow she would be responsible for feeding all of them. Her doubts multiplied in the darkness. What if the men didn't like her cooking? What if she couldn't manage the quantities required? What if her mother got worse without the familiar surroundings of home? But underneath the worry was a small, stubborn flame of determination. She had survived her father's death, her mother's illness, and the slow failure of their restaurant. She could survive this too. The next morning came too early, announced by the crow of roosters and the sound of men moving around the bunkhouse. Clara dressed quickly and made her way to the main house, where Jake was waiting with a cup of coffee and a patient smile. "Ready for your first day?" he asked, leading her into a kitchen that was larger than the entire restaurant had been. Clara's eyes widened as she took in the massive stove, the long wooden table for food preparation, and the shelves lined with pots, pans, and supplies. It was more than she had ever dared dream of working with. "The pantry's through there," Jake said, pointing to a door off the kitchen. "Salt pork, beans, flour, coffee. Whatever you need should be available. If something's missing, just let me know." Clara nodded, her hands already itching to start working. The familiar rhythm of cooking had always been her refuge, and she hoped it would be the same here. "The men will be in shortly," Jake continued. "They're good boys, but they've been living on Charlie's cooking for too long. They might be a little suspicious at first. Change doesn't come easy to cowboys." As if summoned by his words, the sound of boots on the front porch announced the arrival of the ranch hands. Clara's stomach fluttered with nerves, but she squared her shoulders and began cracking eggs into a large bowl. Whatever happened, she was going to give these men the best breakfast she knew how to make. The ranch hands filed into the kitchen in various states of wakefulness, their conversation dying as they noticed Clara at the stove. She felt their curious eyes on her as she worked, but forced herself to focus on the task at hand: scrambled eggs, bacon biscuits, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Boys," Jake's voice cut through the awkward silence, "this is Miss Clara. She'll be cooking for us from now on, so I expect you all to mind your manners." A chorus of mumbled ma'ams and hat tips followed, and Clara felt some of her tension ease. These were just men, tired and hungry after a night's rest, no different from the customers she had served at the restaurant. The first test came when she began serving plates. The men ate in silence at first, their faces carefully neutral as they tasted her cooking. Clara held her breath, waiting for some reaction, some sign of whether she had passed or failed this crucial first impression. It was a young cowhand named Billy who spoke first, his mouth still half full of biscuit. "Mom, this is the finest breakfast I've had in years." The comment broke the tension like a dam bursting, and suddenly the kitchen was filled with the comfortable sounds of men enjoying a good meal. Compliments flew about the fluffiness of the biscuits, the perfect seasoning on the eggs, the coffee that was strong without being bitter. Clara felt a warm glow of satisfaction spread through her chest. This was what she had been born to do. Over the following days, Clara settled into a routine that was exhausting but satisfying. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, spent the morning hours preparing for lunch while checking on her mother, cooked for the midday meal, and then began preparations for dinner. The work was constant, but there was something deeply fulfilling about seeing the ranch hands' faces light up when they entered the kitchen, knowing they were anticipating the meal she had prepared. Jake proved to be a steady, supportive presence. He checked on her progress without being intrusive, made sure she had everything she needed, and helped solve the small problems that inevitably arose. More importantly, he kept his word about Dr. Martin, arranging for the doctor to visit Sarah twice during their first week at the ranch. "She's weak," Dr. Martin told Clara after his second examination, "but she seems more comfortable here than she was in town. The clean air and regular meals are helping, I think." It was true. Sarah's color had improved, and while she still tired easily, her appetite had returned somewhat. Clara began to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had made the right decision. The ranch hands, initially suspicious of change, had quickly become Clara's champions. They bragged about her cooking to anyone who would listen, and she often heard them discussing her meals with the reverence usually reserved for discussions of prize horses or perfect weather. Their obvious appreciation meant more to her than they could know, validating her skills and giving her confidence in her abilities. But it was Jake's quiet approval that meant the most. He never said much about the food, but Clara noticed the way he cleaned his plate at every meal, the small nod of satisfaction he gave her when she served something particularly good, the way his stern features softened when he looked at her across the kitchen. 3 weeks into their stay at the ranch, disaster struck. Clara woke one morning to find her mother burning with fever, her breathing shallow and labored. Panic gripped her as she tried to cool Sarah's forehead with damp cloths, her hands shaking as she realized how helpless she was. Jake appeared in the doorway as if summoned by her distress, still in his nightclothes but fully alert. He took one look at Sarah and immediately began issuing orders. "Billy," he called out to the bunkhouse. "Saddle my fastest horse and ride for Dr. Martin. Tell him it's urgent." He turned back to Clara, who was fighting tears of fear and frustration. "What can I do to help?" "I don't know," Clara whispered. She was fine yesterday. And now, Jake moved to Sarah's bedside and gently placed his hand on her forehead. "She's burning up. Let's get some cool water and see if we can bring the fever down while we wait for the doctor." For the next several hours, Clara and Jake worked together to care for Sarah. They took turns applying cool cloths, encouraging her to sip water, and monitoring her breathing. Clara had never seen this side of Jakey, gentle, patient, completely focused on helping her mother despite having no obligation to do so. Dr. Martin arrived near midday, his examination grim but thorough. "It's pneumonia," he told Clara quietly. "I won't lie to you, she's very sick, but she's been getting stronger these past weeks, and that might make the difference. What can we do? Keep her comfortable, make sure she drinks fluids, and wait. Sometimes that's all we can do." The next few days passed in a haze of worry and exhaustion. Clara continued to cook for the ranch hands, but her heart wasn't in it. Jake noticed her distraction and quietly took over some of her duties, helping serve meals and clean up without being asked. On the fourth day, Sarah's fever broke. Clara woke from an uneasy doze to find her mother's eyes clear and focused for the first time in days. "Clara," Sarah said weakly, "you look terrible." Clara laughed through her tears, relief flooding through her like a warm tide. "You're one to talk, Mama." Sarah smiled and squeezed her daughter's hand. "I had the strangest dreams. I thought I saw your father, and he told me it wasn't time yet. Said I still had work to do here." "Well, I'm glad you listened to him," Clara said, settling into the chair beside the bed that had become her second home over the past few days. "That man," Sarah said, nodding toward the window, where Jake could be seen working with the horses in the corral. "He's been taking care of you while you were taking care of me." Clara followed her mother's gaze and felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with relief over Sarah's recovery. "He's been very kind." "Kind," Sarah repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose that's one word for it." As Sarah continued to recover, Clara gradually returned to her normal routine, though she found herself paying more attention to Jake than she had before. She noticed the way he always made sure she ate something during the busy meal times, how he stepped in to help with heavy lifting without being asked, and how his eyes seemed to find her across crowded rooms as if checking to make sure she was all right. One evening, as Clara was finishing the dinner cleanup, Jake appeared in the kitchen with a cup of coffee for each of them. "Sit," he said gently. "You've been working since before dawn." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully and settled onto a stool beside the big worktable. The kitchen felt peaceful in the evening light, and she realized how much she had come to love this space and the work she did here. "Jake," she said slowly, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for Mama and me. I don't know how we can ever repay you." Jake shook his head. "There's nothing to repay. You've more than earned your keep here. Still, going above and beyond like you did when Mama was sick, that wasn't part of our agreement." Jake was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her face. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course. What are your plans? I mean, after your mother's fully recovered. Do you intend to go back to the restaurant in town?" The question caught Clara off guard, partly because she hadn't given much thought to the future lately, and partly because the idea of leaving the ranch now filled her with an unexpected sadness. I'm not sure," she said honestly. "I suppose I always assumed we would go back eventually. But honestly, I don't know if there's anything left to go back to. The rent on the building, the customers we've lost. What if there was another option?" Clara's heart began to beat faster, though she wasn't sure why. "What do you mean?" Jake set down his coffee cup and looked directly at her. "What if you stayed? Permanently, I mean. The men have never been happier with the food situation, and frankly, neither have I. This place feels more like a home with you and your mother here." Clara felt her cheeks flush with warmth. "Jake, that's very generous, but I couldn't impose on your kindness indefinitely." "It wouldn't be imposing," Jake said quietly. "It would be, well, It would be something I'd very much like." The meaning behind his words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had noticed the way Jake looked at her, the careful attention he paid to her needs and concerns, but she hadn't dared to hope it meant what she secretly wished it might mean. "Jake, she began, but he held up a hand. "You don't need to answer now," he said. "Just think about it. Think about whether you could be happy here, whether this could feel like home to you." That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about Jake's words. The truth was, the ranch already felt more like home than anywhere she had lived since her father's death. The work fulfilled her in ways the struggling restaurant never had. The ranch hands had become like family, and Jake had become something she wasn't quite ready to name. But there were complications. The restaurant still existed, even if it was failing. Her father's dreams still lingered in those dusty rooms in town. And then there was the question of what exactly Jake was offering. A permanent job, or something more. The answer came to her gradually over the following weeks. As summer settled over the ranch in earnest, Clara found herself falling into an easy rhythm with Jake that went beyond their professional relationship. They worked together in the kitchen, shared quiet conversations over morning coffee, and collaborated on small improvements to make the ranch run more smoothly. More importantly, Clara began to see glimpses of the man behind Jake's careful reserve. She learned that he had grown up on this very land, inheriting the ranch from his father and building it into one of the most successful operations in the county through hard work and careful management. She discovered that he read voraciously, borrowing books from a traveling merchant who came through twice a year, and she saw how the death of his wife had left him lonely and guarded, afraid to open his heart again. The breakthrough came on a warm evening in late July. Clara had finished cleaning up after dinner and was sitting on the porch of the small cabin, enjoying the cooler air and watching the sun set over the rolling hills. Jake approached from the main house, 2 glasses of lemonade in his hands. "Thought you might like some," he said, settling onto the porch steps beside her. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the evening. Cattle lowing in the distance, the soft nicker of horses in the corral, the gentle creaking of the windmill turning in the breeze. "Clara," Jake said eventually, "I want to tell you something." She turned to look at him, noting the unusual tension in his shoulders. "When Mary died," he began, referring to his late wife, "I thought that was the end of happiness for me. I figured I'd work the ranch, take care of business, and that would be enough. I wasn't looking for anything more." Clara waited, sensing that he needed to work through his thoughts at his own pace. "But then you came here," Jake continued, "and everything changed. Not just because of your cooking, though that's been truly wonderful. It's you. The way you care for your mother, the way you've thrown yourself into making this place better, the way you smile when you think no one's watching. You've brought life back to this ranch, Clara. You've brought light back into my life." Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved by the raw honesty in his voice. "I know I'm not much of a catch," Jake said with a self-deprecating smile. "I'm older than you, set in my ways, and this ranch is about as far from civilization as you can get. But if you'd be willing, if you think you could be happy here, I'd like to ask you to stay. Not as an employee, but as my wife." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped, had dreamed, but hearing the actual words still came as a shock. "Jake," she whispered, Yes, I would like that very much." The smile that spread across Jake's face was like sunrise after a long, dark night. He reached for her hands, his calloused fingers gentle as they intertwined with hers. "Really? You're sure?" Clara said, laughing through her tears. "I love this place, I love the work. And Jake, I love you." Jake leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It tasted like new beginnings and second chances, like the future they would build together on this land under the endless western sky. When they finally broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against Jake's and smiled. "What about Mama? She's still not completely well. Sarah's family now," Jake said simply. "This is her home too, for as long as she wants it." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's voice called from inside the cabin. "Clara, is everything all right out there?" Clara and Jake exchanged amused glances before Clara called back, "Everything's perfect, Mama. Come out here, we have something to tell you." Sarah appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but steadily, her health much improved from their first desperate days at the ranch. She took one look at Clara and Jake sitting close together on the porch steps, their hands still clasped, and smiled knowingly. "Well, it's about time," she said, settling into the wooden chair Jake had built for her. "I was beginning to think you two would never figure it out." Clara laughed in surprise. "You knew? Honey, I may be sick, but I'm not blind. That man's been looking at you like you hung the moon since the day we arrived." Jake's cheeks reddened slightly, but he was smiling. "Was I that obvious?" "Obvious enough," Sarah said with satisfaction. "So when's the wedding?" Clara and Jake looked at each other, both suddenly aware that they had jumped from proposal to acceptance without discussing any of the practical details. "Soon," Jake said finally, "if Clara agrees. I don't see any reason to wait." "Neither do I," Clara said, her heart full to bursting with happiness and possibility. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony in the ranch's main room, surrounded by the hands who had become Clara's brothers and the few neighbors who made up their extended community. Sarah, much stronger now, stood beside Clara as her matron of honor, tears of joy streaming down her face as she watched her daughter pledge her life to the man who had saved them both. The celebration afterward was exactly what Clara would have chosen: simple, heartfelt, and filled with the people who mattered most. The ranch hands had surprised her by cleaning and decorating the main room with wildflowers, and several of the neighboring ranchers' wives had contributed dishes for the feast. It wasn't fancy by city standards, but it was perfect for them. As evening settled over the celebration, Clara found herself standing at the kitchen window, looking out over the land that was now truly her home. Jake came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. Clara leaned back against his solid warmth and smiled. "Only that Papa couldn't be here to see this. He would have loved you, Jake. He would have been so happy to know Mama and I found a home like this." "I think he does know," Jake said, "and I think he'd be proud of how strong and brave his daughter turned out to be." Through the window, Clara could see the small cabin where she and her mother had spent their first months on the ranch. Tomorrow, Sarah would move into the main house, into a sunny room that Jake had been preparing for weeks, and Clara would begin her new life as mistress of the Morrison Ranch, partner to a good man, and keeper of the kitchen that had become the heart of their small community. It wasn't the life she had planned as a young girl, helping her parents build their restaurant dream, but it was better than anything she could have imagined. A life built on love, hard work, and the endless possibility of the frontier. As she watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Clara Morrison smiled and began planning tomorrow's breakfast for the family she had found in the most unexpected place. The restaurant in town had been sold to pay their debts, but Clara felt no sadness about its loss. Some dreams, she realized, were meant to be stepping stones to better things, and sometimes the greatest courage was in letting go of what was to embrace what could be. In the kitchen of the Morrison Ranch, surrounded by the people she loved and the work that fulfilled her, Clara had found something more valuable than her father's dream. She had found her own.